That's right. What's that, man? Leroy and Marv. Come on in and take a seat. Okay. Yep. Have any of you been here before?
A long time ago.
All right. This is what was known as the Phillips family mine. They started mining coal here in 1890. They mined coal until 1910. Then the mine sat idle until 1962 when the city of Beckley acquired it to make its exhibition coal mine. And whenever they mined coal here, what they were mining it for was for house coal, for heating and cooking. The seam we're in here is what's known as the Sewell seam. And in this area, it ranged in thickness from 28 inches to 44 inches. Needless to say, they were crawling everywhere they went. On the side of it, you had to string these little metal check tags like this one. Now, it had his payroll number on it. Whenever he'd load the car, he'd take one of his tags, hang it on that hook. Car go out to the dump, Wayman would take his tag off and give him credit for his coal. But unfortunately, even back then, we had some dishonest individuals running around. If one of those persons happened to be in the haulage entry when the cars were being taken out, every once in a while, they'd reach over there, flip a tag off the car, put their tag on. That way he'd get paid for a ton of coal he didn't load, and somebody else would be a ton. Canary bird. Now, a little canary had physiology that could sense a change in the atmosphere. So miners started carrying a cage like his canary into the workplace with him. Set him over to the side, and as long as his little canary was singing, he knew things was good. If something happened and he realized he hadn't heard his canary for a while, and he looked, his little canary was in distress, then he knew something was wrong. He'd get out of his workplace, work on his ventilation to get rid of whatever it was disturbing his canary. And they carried the canaries for a couple of years until they developed their old flame safety light. So flame safety light served two purposes. Methane, lighter than air. It's going to be on top. Take that lamp, put it up against the top, and you watch that flame. That flame started to grow. You knew you had methane. But also with this, you could check for low oxygen. It's heavier than air. It's laying on the mine floor. You take your lamp and set it on the floor and watch that flame again. And if that flame started to go out, then you knew you had low oxygen. So you had to buy bacon to feed the family. Whenever they would fry up the bacon, they would save the grease. That way he didn't have to buy quite as much kerosene or lamp oil from the company store. Save himself a little bit of money. These things, they would burn for about 2 hours. And then you'd have to refuel it. And they wore these things for several years until they come up with our good old carbide light. Now carbide, it's a mineral. And whenever you wet it, it causes a chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction makes acetylene gas. And if it works right, it pops. Come on, baby, you can do it. Maybe you know it's going to work right. Huh. I had it working before whenever I come in. Made my fireballs run. I'm gonna get smart and bring me a cigarette lighter. Flame. Now, Big improvement, this reflector behind the flame. You think about that old candle or that old wick, where was his light at? It was up there over his head, wasn't it? Now this thing, normally that flame's gonna come out about right there. But for some reason, she's being contrary today. Now, these things, it'd go with him. It'd have a little bit more light normally. Now, like I said, 4 hours for a burn time on that thing. And then they'd have to empty out that pot and put in fresh carbide. And whenever he did that, right there's what he had to work in. They not only had the mine, they had the store, they had the housing, they had the school, they even building churches, and everything that old miner used, like I said over on the other side, everything he used to mine coal, he had to buy it. And he could only buy it from the company store. Because the company didn't pay in currency like we get today. They got paid in scrip. And that scrip was only good at that company store. He couldn't go down the road and buy. He had to get it right there from the company store. So you know, it's the coal and start drilling. And they would drill 3 4-foot holes. One in each side and one in the center. And once he'd get through with his drill, then he'd get his powder bag. Back then, they still used black powder. And he would have papers. He would roll him up 3 shots. He'd put him a shot in each hole. Have him a tamping rod like this. He'd tamp that powder in the hole. Then have him some clay. You take that clay, tamp up against that powder. What he's doing is confining that shot. If he didn't do it, it'd be just like a gun barrel and shoot right back out. Once he got all 3 holes tamped up with his clay, he had him a pick. He'd pick him a hole through that clay back into the powder. And then he would work his fuse back into the powder. And he would do that in all 3 holes. And he'd take those 3 fuses, tamp them up against he'd take those 3 fuses and he'd tie them up. And he would call out, fire, fire, fire in the hole. Light the fuse, get out around the corner. Whenever that shot would go off, he'd wait a couple minutes, let the dust and smoke clear, and then back his car in and start loading coal. Now this one here, it come in 3 sections. First section, pie pan. Just as it says, you might bake a whole pie or cake or some cookies to have for dessert. Second section, it's what he'd carry: sandwiches, fruits, vegetables, nuts, whatever it was he liked to eat. Carried in that. That pail, that's what he had to drink for the day. So needless to say, that's not a whole lot. Some old guys had to, learn how to regulate their fluid intake to make sure they had enough drink to get them through the day. And unfortunately, like we talked about over at the old mine car, every once in a while, you have no working buddy that's working in the mine with you. For whatever reason, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he'd have all his water drank and he'd be thirsty. He'd start looking up down the entry, see if he could spot him another bucket. He'd see one hanging on the timber up above him. He'd just ease up through there. He'd look in place there, the man's up there working away, not paying any attention. He'd get his bucket and get him a drink of water. How about that?
I'm not even kidding.